You know, people often ask me what the hardest part of my job is. They think it's the shouting matches, the addiction battles, or the infidelity that rips families apart. But the truth is, the hardest thing I ever have to deal with is a delusion that has become a survival mechanism. When you look into the eyes of a young woman who has built an entire fortress around herself, a fortress made of fantasy, lies, and rigid defense mechanisms, you aren't just looking at a liar. You are looking at someone who has decided that reality is just too painful to inhabit. I've always said that you cannot change what you do not acknowledge. But what happens when the person sitting across from you acknowledges a reality that simply does not exist for the rest of us? That is where the real work begins. And that is exactly where I found myself when I first heard about a 24-year-old woman named Sarah, or as she demanded to be called, Her Royal Highness Princess Serafina. When the producers first brought this file to my desk, it looked like a tabloid joke. It had all the makings of a viral internet sensation where people point and laugh. You had a grown woman living in a modest suburb in Ohio, dressing in elaborate, albeit thrifted, Victorian-style gowns, wearing a tiara to the grocery store, and speaking with a posh, transatlantic accent that sounded like it was lifted from a 1,940 seconds movie. Her parents, Bob and Martha, were at the end of their rope. They were exhausted, financially drained, and humiliated. They told my team that Sarah had refused to work for the last 3 years because, in her mind, royalty does not labor. She had been writing letters to foreign embassies, demanding diplomatic immunity for parking tickets, and expecting her retired parents to wait on her hand and foot as if they were palace staff. On the surface, it was ridiculous. It was the kind of story that makes people roll their eyes and change the channel. But I stopped reading the summary and started looking at the footage they had sent over. I watched a clip of this young woman sitting at her kitchen table. Her posture was rigid, perfectly straight. She held a chipped coffee mug with her pinky extended, sipping tepid water as if it were the finest Earl Grey. But it wasn't the affectation that caught my attention. It was her eyes. There was a desperate, terrified emptiness behind that performance. She wasn't playing dress up for attention. She was playing dress up for her life. I saw a girl who was drowning, and this persona, this Princess Serafina, was the only life raft she could find. I told my producers immediately that we were doing this story, not to mock her, and not to indulge her, but to find out what was so broken in her real life that she had to invent a fake one just to get out of bed in the morning. The day of the taping, the tension backstage was palpable. Usually, guests are nervous, pacing around, maybe crying. Sarah was different. My stage manager told me that she was refusing to come out of her dressing room because the water provided was not up to standard, and she demanded a formal introduction before she would grace us with her presence. Bob and Martha were in the hallway, looking like they had aged 10 years in the last 10 months. I went to speak with them first, before the lights and the audience, just to get a read on the family dynamic. Bob was a blue-collar guy, a retired machinist with calloused hands and a look of utter defeat. Martha was anxious, fluttering around, apologizing for everything, constantly checking her phone as if she expected a bomb to go off. They told me that they felt like hostages in their own home. They described a life where they had to walk on eggshells, literally bowing to their daughter to avoid a screaming meltdown that could last for hours. They were enabling her, certainly. They were feeding the monster because they were afraid of the child inside the monster. Bob admitted to me, with tears in his eyes, that he had spent his retirement savings on royal decree, stationery, and custom dresses because he was afraid that if he shattered her illusion, she might harm herself. That is a powerful lever to pull. That is emotional blackmail, whether Sarah knew she was doing it or not. I saw a pattern of fear governing this household. The parents were afraid of the truth, and the daughter was afraid of the world. When I finally walked onto the stage, the audience was already buzzing. They had seen the intro package. They had seen the footage of Sarah yelling at a barista for not addressing her by her title. They were ready to judge. I sat down and looked toward the tunnel where the guests enter. I had instructed the floor director to introduce her simply as Sarah. I wanted to see the reaction. I wanted to see if the persona could withstand the first strike of reality. When her name was announced, just Sarah, she didn't move. The silence stretched out. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The audience started to murmur. This was the control game. She was testing the boundaries of her power in this new environment. I signaled to the producers to wait. I wasn't going to play into the demand, but I wasn't going to drag her out either. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she emerged. She was wearing a long velvet gown that looked heavy and hot under the stage lights. She had a rhinestone tiara pinned into hair that was meticulously curled. She walked with a slow, deliberate gait, chin held high, refusing to make eye contact with the audience. She looked like a ghost from another century dropped into a television studio. She sat down, smoothed her dress, and looked at me with an expression of imperious annoyance. She didn't look crazy in the chaotic sense. She looked composed, which in some ways is more disturbing. It meant the delusion was organized. It had structure. I started simply. I asked her why she was here. She looked at me, blinked slowly, and spoke in that affected, clipped accent. She told me she was here to clear her name, to correct the record, and to force her subjects, meaning her parents, to acknowledge her birthright. She claimed that she had recovered memories, repressed memories, of being switched at birth, of a childhood in a palace, of being hidden away in Ohio for her own protection. As she spoke, I watched her body language. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she hid them in the folds of her dress. She was reciting a script she had written in her head 1,000 times. I turned to the parents, who were sitting on the couch next to her, looking small and withered. I asked Martha to tell me about Sarah's childhood. This is where the cracks in the porcelain began to show. Martha described a normal, happy little girl who loved soccer and finger painting. She brought photos, undeniable, concrete proof of a suburban American childhood. Birthday parties at Chuck E., cheese, camping trips in a station wagon, school plays where she was a tree, not a princess. I projected these images on the big screen. I wanted to see Sarah's reaction to the visual evidence of her own history. Most people, when caught in a lie, will look away or get angry. Sarah did neither. She looked at the photos with a sense of detached pity, as if I were showing her pictures of a stranger. She told me, quite calmly, that the girl in the photos was a decoy. She explained that the memories Martha was talking about were implanted or fabricated to keep her safe from her enemies. It was a sophisticated defense. Every piece of logic I threw at her, she had a fantastical explanation for. If I pointed out her birth certificate, she claimed it was forged by the agency. If I pointed out her DNA test, she claimed the lab had been compromised. This is what we call a closed-loop delusional system. It is self-sealing. Any evidence against a belief is twisted to become evidence for the belief. But here is the thing about psychology. There is no effect without a cause. You don't wake up one Tuesday and decide you are the Grand Duchess of a non-existent nation unless being Sarah from Ohio is unbearable. I needed to find the trigger. I needed to find the moment where reality broke her heart so badly that she decided to divorce it. I shifted my focus away from the royalty debate. I stopped asking about the tiara and started asking about the timeline. I asked Bob and Martha when this started. When did the accent appear? When did the demands begin? They looked at each other, hesitant. They were hiding something. not out of malice, but out of shame. Finally, Bob spoke up. He said it started about 3 years ago, right after the incident. The room went quiet. I leaned in. This was the key. This was the inflection point. Tell me about the incident, I said. Sarah stiffened. For the first time, the mask slipped. The regal composure cracked just a fraction, and I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated panic in her eyes. She tried to interrupt, raising her voice, commanding her father to be silent, using her royal voice to drown him out. "We shall not speak of the dark times," she shouted, standing up. "I forbid it!" But I wasn't going to let that go. I looked at Bob and told him to continue. I told him that secrets are what make us sick, and if he wanted his daughter back, he had to tell the truth about what happened 3 years ago. The story that came out was not about palaces or diplomatic immunity. It was about a trauma so mundane and yet so devastating that it shattered a young girl's self-worth. It was about a relationship, a betrayal, and a loss of identity that had nothing to do with lineage and everything to do with being loved. Bob took a deep breath, his hands clasping and unclasping in his lap, the friction of his rough palms audible in the silence of the studio. He began to recount the story of a girl named Sarah, not Serafina. 3 years ago, Sarah wasn't waiting for a coronation, she was waiting for a wedding. She was 21 years old, a junior in a rigorous nursing program, and she was engaged to a young man she had been with since high school. By all accounts, she was a perfectionist, the kind of young woman who tied her worth directly to her achievements and her relationships. She had the grades, she had the ring, and she had the future mapped out in ink, not pencil. But life has a way of erasing your plans when you least expect it. And for Sarah, the eraser came down hard and fast. Within the span of a single week in November, her entire world collapsed. Her fiancé, the boy she had built her identity around, sat her down and called off the wedding. He admitted he had met someone else, someone Sarah knew, someone she considered a friend. That betrayal alone is enough to knock the wind out of anybody. It cuts deep, it attacks your self-esteem at its root, but the universe wasn't done with her yet. Distraught and unable to focus, she went into her final exams for nursing school, completely compromised. She failed, and she didn't just fail, she bombed so spectacularly that she was dismissed from the program. In 7 days, she went from a future nurse and wife to a single dropout living back in her childhood bedroom. As Bob told this story, the audience was dead silent. You could feel the shift in the room. They weren't looking at a freak show anymore, they were looking at a tragedy. I watched Sarah closely while her father spoke. She was doing everything she could to tune him out. She started humming a low, classical tune, staring at the ceiling, tapping her fingers on the armrest of her chair. It was a childish tactic, covering her ears to block out the monster, but it told me everything I needed to know. The truth was radioactive to her. She couldn't handle even a dosage of it. I turned back to Bob and asked what happened next. He explained that for the first month, she just cried. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't sleep, she just lay in the dark. That is a natural depression. That is grief. But then something snapped. She started watching movies, historical dramas, stories about queens and duchesses who were exiled, misunderstood, or hidden away. She became obsessed with the idea of noble blood. Slowly, the crying stopped. The sweatpants disappeared, replaced by long skirts. The Midwestern twang was polished away, replaced by that transatlantic clip. She stopped answering to Sarah. She told her parents that the pain she felt was simply proof that she was too sensitive for this common world because she didn't belong in it. She rewrote the narrative. She didn't fail nursing school. Nursing was beneath her station. Her fiancé didn't dump her. He was a commoner who couldn't handle her magnificence. The delusion was the morphine she prescribed herself to kill the pain of being ordinary and rejected. But here is where the story shifts from sad to dangerous. Here is where we get into the escalation. A delusion doesn't survive on its own. It needs fuel. And unfortunately, Bob and Martha were the gas station. I looked at Martha and asked her how they reacted when Sarah first demanded to be called Your Highness. Martha looked down at her shoes and admitted that at first they thought it was a phase, a quirky way of dealing with stress. They played along. They called her princess to get a smile out of her. They bought her the first vintage dress because they were just so relieved to see her out of bed. They thought they were helping. They thought they were being supportive parents. But there is a fine line between support and enabling, and they crossed it at 90 miles an hour. The demands grew. It started with the name, then it moved to the diet. Sarah refused to eat processed peasant food. She demanded fresh organic produce, specific cuts of meat, and teas imported from England. Bob and Martha are on a fixed income. They are retired. They dipped into their savings to buy her fancy jams and specialized linens because every time they said no, Sarah would spiral. She would scream, throw things, or threaten to harm herself, claiming that her captors, her parents, were mistreating a royal dignitary. I had to stop Martha right there. I leaned in and looked her in the eye. You realize I said that you have been held hostage in your own home by a terrorist in a tiara? It sounds harsh, and maybe it is, but sometimes you have to use a sledgehammer to crack the concrete. They needed to see the reality of what they were doing. They were so afraid of her suicide threats, so afraid of her fragility, that they allowed her to tyrannize the household. Sarah had effectively set up a dictatorship where she was the queen and her parents were the serfs who paid the bills. Bob admitted that they had stopped inviting friends over. They stopped going out. Their world had shrunk down to the size of Sarah's delusion. They were exhausted. Bob confessed that he was still working part-time at a hardware store just to pay for Sarah's royal wardrobe expenses, hiding the receipts from Martha so she wouldn't worry about the dwindling bank account. This was a family in crisis, bleeding out financially and emotionally, all to sustain a fantasy that was keeping their daughter sick. I turned my chair to face Sarah directly. She was still looking away, feigning disinterest, but I could see the rapid pulse in her neck. The physiological signs of stress were all there. She knew I had the map of her trauma, and she was terrified I was going to force her to walk the territory. Princess Serafina, I said, using her title with a deliberate, neutral tone. She snapped her head toward me, eyes lighting up, thinking she had won a concession. I want to understand the rules of your kingdom. In your world, does a queen rely on retired machinists to pay for her velvet? She blinked, caught off guard. A queen, she stammered, falling back into the accent, is entitled to the resources of her realm. These people have been entrusted with my care. It is their duty, but they are broke, I said flatly. The realm is bankrupt. The castle is in foreclosure. What does a queen do then? That is impossible, she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. The treasury is vast. They are simply withholding it from me to teach me some pedestrian lesson. There is no treasury, Sarah, I said, dropping the title. There is a checking account at a local bank in Ohio, and it is empty. Do not call me that name, she shrieked, slamming her hand on the armrest. The sudden burst of rage was startling. It wasn't the composed anger of a monarch, it was the tantrum of a cornered child. I am Serafina. I am of the blood royal. You will respect my station. I respect you enough to tell you the truth, I shot back, keeping my voice level but firm. And the truth is, You are hurting the only two people in this world who have stood by you. You are bleeding them dry. You are 24 years old, able-bodied, intelligent, and articulate. And yet you are sitting here in a costume demanding tribute from people who love you because you are too scared to look in the mirror and see the girl who got her heart broken 3 years ago. I was not heartbroken, she yelled, standing up now. She paced the small area in front of her seat, her dress swishing around her. I was awakened. That life, that mundane, gray, pathetic life was a prison. Mark was a jailer. Nursing was servitude. I was meant for more. I remember the palace. I remember the gardens. You remember what you need to remember to survive, I told her. But we are going to look at the cost of that survival, because right now, the price tag is your parents' lives. I signaled to the production team. I had prepared something that I knew would be risky. It was an escalation of the confrontation, but we had to break through the armor. We had contacted the nursing school she had flunked out of. We had her transcript. And more importantly, we had a statement from Mark, the ex-fiancé. He hadn't wanted to appear on camera. He had moved on, married, and had a child. But he sent a letter. Sarah, I said, holding up the piece of paper, I have a letter here from Mark. She froze mid-pace. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale beneath the heavy stage makeup. She stared at the paper in my hand as if it were a loaded gun. That is a lie, she whispered. Mark is an agent of the usurpers. He doesn't exist to me. He exists, I said, and he has something to say to you. Do you want to hear it, or are we going to keep playing pretend while your parents go bankrupt? The studio was silent. This was the tipping point. If she refused to listen, we were at an impasse. If she listened, the wall might come down. She looked at her parents, then at me, and finally she sat back down, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. She just braced herself, gripping the arms of the chair until her knuckles were white. Read it, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom but laced with fear. Read his lies. I unfolded the letter slowly. The paper rustled in the quiet studio, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud. I adjusted my glasses and looked at Sarah one last time before beginning. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw set so tight I could see the muscles bunching. She was preparing for impact. Sarah, I began reading Mark's words. I know it's been 3 years. I know things ended badly, but I need you to know that I never wanted to destroy you. When I left, it was because we weren't right for each other, not because you weren't enough. I hear about what's happening about the princess persona, and it breaks my heart. Not because I want you back, but because the Sarah I knew was brilliant. She was funny. She was going to be an amazing nurse. You don't need a tiara to be important. You just need to be yourself. Please, let your parents off the hook. Let yourself off the hook. I lowered the paper. It wasn't a cruel letter. It was kind, final, and painfully grounded in reality. It stripped away the villain narrative she had constructed for him. He wasn't a monster or a commoner who couldn't handle her. He was just a guy who moved on. And that is often harder to accept than hatred. Indifference is the real enemy of the ego. Sarah didn't explode this time. She didn't scream. She slumped. It was as if the air had been let out of her. The rigid royal posture collapsed. She looked down at her lap, and for the first time, she looked like a 24-year-old girl in a thrift store costume. A single tear tracked through her heavy foundation. She quickly wiped it away with a gloved hand, trying to regain her composure, but the dam had cracked. "He doesn't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. The accent was slipping. It was fluctuating between the posh British affectation and her natural Ohio cadence. He doesn't know the weight of the crown." "There is no crown, Sarah," I said softly. I didn't shout. I didn't lecture. I just leaned in. There is just a lot of pain. And it's okay to be in pain. It's okay to be rejected. It happens to the best of us. It happens to queens, and it happens to machinist daughters. But you have built a castle out of pain, and you have locked yourself inside. I stood up and walked over to the whiteboard we often use for mapping out behaviors. I picked up a marker. I want to show you something. This is what we call the cycle of avoidance. I drew a circle. At the top, we have the trigger, the breakup, the failure at school. That creates pain. To avoid the pain, you create the persona, Princess Serafina. That gives you relief. It makes you feel special, protected, above it all. But then reality intrudes bills, parents, the lack of a real kingdom. That creates anxiety. So to fight the anxiety, you have to escalate the persona. Louder demands, bigger dresses, more control. And that just leads back to more pain because you are isolated and lonely. You are on a hamster wheel, Sarah, and you are running yourself and your parents into the ground. She looked at the diagram. She was listening. She was processing. This was the analytical part of her brain, waking up the part that had been a straight-A nursing student before the crash. "I'm not crazy," she said, her voice small. It was the first time she had defended her sanity rather than her title. "I never said you were crazy," I replied firmly. "I said you were hurt. And smart people can do very irrational things when they are hurt. You used your intelligence to build a complex delusion because the alternative was facing a depression that felt like it was going to kill you. But Sarah, look at your parents." I gestured to Bob and Martha. They were holding hands, tears streaming down their faces. They looked exhausted, but there was so much love in their eyes, it was palpable. "They are still here," I said. "After the screaming, the demands, the financial ruin, they are still sitting right next to you. That is loyalty. That is royalty." You want to talk about noble blood? Look at that man's hands. He worked 40 years to give you a life, and he is still working to buy you fake decree paper because he loves you that much. You are looking for devotion in fairy tales when you have it sitting right next to you on a beige couch. Sarah turned her head slowly and looked at her father. Bob looked back at her, his chin trembling. "We just want our daughter back, baby," he choked out. "We miss Sarah. We love Serafina, if that's who you need to be, but we miss Sarah." That was the breakthrough. It wasn't a sudden epiphany where the clouds parted. It was a messy, ugly, beautiful moment of human connection. Sarah let out a sob, a real guttural sound that had nothing to do with etiquette. She reached out and took her father's hand. She didn't say, "I'm sorry" yet. That was too big a step, but she held on. She anchored herself to him. "I don't know how to stop," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The accent was gone completely now. "I don't know who I am if I'm not her. I'm just a failure. I'm just a dropout." "You are not a failure," I told her, moving back to my chair. "You are a work in progress. You hit a wall, you crashed. Okay, so what? You pick up the pieces. You don't put on a costume and pretend the car is still running. You get out, you check the engine, and you fix it. You have value, Sarah, not because of some imaginary bloodline, but because you are a human being with talents, with a heart, and with a future that you are currently ignoring. Now came the hard part, the offer. We couldn't just send her back to Ohio with a hug and a good luck. The patterns were too entrenched. If she went home today, she'd be back in the tiara by Tuesday. The environment was a trigger. She needed a reset, a hard reset. I have a plan for you, I said, but it's going to require you to be brave, braver than you've ever been. It's easy to play a princess. It's hard to do the work of a patient. I told her about a dual diagnosis treatment center we work with, a place that specializes in trauma and personality disorders, a place where there are no costumes, no titles, and no enabling parents. I've arranged for you to go there, I said. They are ready for you. But here is the deal. You go as Sarah. The dresses stay in Ohio. The tiara stays in Ohio. You go there and you deal with the grief, the loss, and the shame. You unpack it all. It will be the hardest thing you ever do. But if you do it, I promise you, you will find a life on the other side that is actually worth living. A real life. I paused and looked at Bob and Martha. And for you two, I added, we have arranged counseling as well. You need to learn how to set boundaries. You need to learn how to love her without enabling the sickness. If she comes back and demands to be called Your Highness, you need to be strong enough to say, no, Sarah, I love you, but no. Sarah looked terrified. The prospect of stripping away the persona was like asking her to walk naked into a blizzard. She looked at her parents. She looked at me. She looked down at her velvet dress, fingering the fabric. This was her armor. I was asking her to take it off. I can't go today, she said, panic rising again. I have correspondence to attend to. I have duties. No, I said, cutting her off. That's the addiction talking. That's the fear talking. You go today, right from this stage to the car. If you go home, you won't come back. You know it, and I know it. This is the moment, Sarah. This is the fork in the road. You choose the fantasy, you lose your family. You choose reality, you get your life back. What's it going to be? The silence stretched out. The audience held its breath. You could hear a pin drop. Sarah looked at her father again. Bob squeezed her hand hard. Please, he whispered. Please, Sarah. She took a shuddering breath. She reached up and with trembling fingers unpinned the rhinestone tiara from her hair. It got stuck for a second, tangled in the curls, a final stubborn resistance, but she yanked it free. She held it in her hands for a moment, staring at the cheap plastic gems that had meant so much to her. Then she placed it on the small table between us. Okay, she said, I'll go. The audience erupted. Bob and Martha dissolved into tears, hugging her. It was a victory. But I knew better than to celebrate too early. Getting someone to say yes on stage is just the starting gun. The race is long, and it is run in the mud, uphill, in the dark. We sent her off to the facility that afternoon. The update I got 2 weeks later was complicated. Sarah had arrived and immediately tried to manipulate the staff. She refused to participate in group therapy, claiming it was common. She tried to hoard food in her room. But the staff there are professionals. They didn't bend. They didn't bow. They simply held the mirror up day after day. About 3 weeks in, I got a call from her primary therapist. They had a breakthrough. During an equine therapy session working with horses, Sarah had broken down. Horses don't care about titles. They respond to authenticity. If you are fake, the horse won't trust you. Sarah couldn't command the horse. She had to connect with it. And in that frustration, the dam finally broke for good. She cried for the loss of her fiancé. She cried for the nursing degree. She cried for the 3 years she had lost to the fantasy. 6 months later, Sarah walked back onto my stage. The young woman who walked out from behind the backstage doors was unrecognizable. The velvet gowns were gone, replaced by a simple pair of dark jeans and a soft, cream-colored blouse. The heavy stage makeup, the mask she had used to paint on a regal indifference, was stripped away, revealing a fresh face that looked both younger and older at the same time. Younger because the artificial severity was gone. Older because there was a maturity in her eyes that only comes from walking through the fire and surviving. Her hair was loose, falling naturally around her shoulders, no longer tortured into stiff Victorian curls. She walked with confidence, but it wasn't the rigid, imperious stride of Princess Serafina. It was the grounded walk of Sarah from Ohio. The audience applauded, but this time it wasn't the polite, confused clapping from before. It was warm, encouraging. They saw the transformation. I stood up to greet her. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm. She made eye contact. She smiled, and it reached her eyes. "Hello, Dr. Phil," she said. No accent, just a clear American voice. "Hello, Sarah," I replied, gesturing for her to sit. "You look present." She laughed a little nervously. "I feel present." It's a strange feeling, actually. A lot louder and brighter than the world I was living in. We sat down, and I asked her to tell us about the last 6 months. She didn't sugarcoat it. She told us that the first month was hell. She described the physical pain of letting go of the delusion. She said it felt like withdrawal from a drug. Her brain kept trying to snap back into the fantasy whenever she felt stressed or insecure. She would catch herself starting to speak in the accent or reaching for a royal excuse to avoid a difficult chore. "It was like a reflex," she explained. "Every time I felt small, Serafina would try to step in and make me feel big. I had to learn to just sit with the feeling of being small. I had to learn that being average isn't a death sentence." I asked her about the equine therapy, about that moment with the horse. His name was Buster, she smiled. He was this stubborn old quarter horse. I walked into the pen and tried to order him around. I stood tall. I used my commanding voice, and he just ignored me. He actually turned his butt to me and started eating grass. It made me so angry, I started crying, yelling at him that he didn't know who I was. And the therapist just stood there and said, "He knows exactly who you are? You're a scared girl yelling at a horse." That broke me. I sat down in the dirt and just wept. And eventually, Buster came over and nudged my shoulder. He didn't connect with the princess. He connected with the sadness. We brought Bob and Martha out. They looked 10 years younger. The gray pallor of stress was gone from their faces. Bob was wearing a new shirt, and he walked with a bounce in his step. They hugged their daughter, and it was a real hug, equal, reciprocal. No bowing, no walking on eggshells. Bob took the mic. "We have our daughter back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have dinner together. We talk about the news. We talk about the weather." It sounds boring, but it's the most beautiful thing in the world to us. Martha admitted that the therapy had been hard for them, too. They had to learn to say no. They had to learn that their fear of Sarah's fragility was actually keeping her fragile. "We had to stop saving her from reality," Martha said. "We had to let her fall so she could learn how to get up." I turned back to Sarah. "So, what's the plan now?" The castle is closed. The throne is empty. What does Sarah do on a Tuesday? She took a deep breath. Well, I'm working, she said. I got a job at a bookstore. It's quiet. I'm surrounded by stories, but I don't have to live in them anymore. I'm paying my parents back, bit by bit. It's not much, but every paycheck goes to them. I want to pay for every single dress, every ounce of tea. And nursing? I asked. She paused. I'm not ready yet. Maybe one day, but right now, I'm taking classes at the community college. Just general credits. I'm trying to figure out who I am without the pressure of a specific career path. I'm relearning how to be a student, how to fail a quiz and not let it destroy my world. It was the best answer she could have given. She wasn't rushing to replace one identity with another. She was doing the work of building a foundation. But I had one more question, the hard one. Do you miss her? I asked. Do you miss Serafina? The room went quiet. Sarah looked down at her hands, then back up at me. Sometimes, she admitted honestly, she was safe, she was powerful, she never felt rejected. In her world, everything happened for a reason, a grand reason. In the real world, sometimes things just suck for no reason. It's harder out here, it's colder, but she looked at her parents, it's real. And the love I feel now, it's real too. Serafina was adored by imaginary subjects. Sarah is loved by real people. I'll take the real people. I looked at the audience. You see, I said, this is what courage looks like. It isn't slaying a dragon. It isn't conquering a kingdom. It is waking up in the morning, looking at your flaws, looking at your mistakes, and saying, I am enough. Sarah, I am proud of you. You have done the work. You have climbed a mountain that most people can't even see. We wrapped the show on a high note. The audience gave her a standing ovation, not for the spectacle, but for the human being. As the credits rolled, I watched Sarah laughing with her parents. She looked ordinary, and it was magnificent. Backstage, after the cameras were off, I had a private moment with her. She was packing up her bag to head to the airport. Dr. Phil, she said, stopping me, thank you for not believing the lie. Everyone else either laughed or played along. You were the first person who just stopped it. You did the work, Sarah. I told her. I just turned on the lights. You had to choose to open your eyes. I walked back to my dressing room, thinking about the nature of reality. We all tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves we are victims or heroes, or that we are unlovable, or that we are destined for greatness. We build these little narratives to make sense of the chaos. Sarah's story was just an extreme version of what we all do. She built a castle to hide from a storm. But castles have thick walls. They keep the storm out, but they keep the light out too. I sat down and looked at the file on my desk. Case closed, I wrote on the folder. But in this line of work, a case is never really closed. Life goes on. Sarah would have bad days. She might be tempted to put the tiara back on when the world gets too sharp. But now she has tools. Now she has a map. And most importantly, she knows that she can survive the fall. The hardest part of my job isn't the shouting. It's convincing people that they are strong enough to handle the truth. Today, Sarah believed it. And that is a good day at the office. As I drove home that evening, the California sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that no filter could replicate, I found my mind drifting back to Sarah. It's funny how some guests stick with you. I've interviewed thousands of people, murderers, addicts, cheaters, victims, but the princess struck a chord. Maybe because her struggle was so fundamentally human. We all want to be special. We all want to matter. And when the world tells us we are ordinary or worse, that we are failures, the temptation to retreat into a fantasy where we are the protagonist is incredibly seductive. We live in a culture that feeds this, don't we? Social media is just a digital version of Sarah's tiara. We curate our lives, filter our faces, and present a royal version of ourselves to the world while we sit in our sweatpants feeling lonely. Sarah just took it offline and made it literal. She was a mirror for a generation that is terrified of being average. I thought about Bob and Martha too. Their journey was just as critical. They had to learn that love isn't about removing all obstacles from your child's path. Sometimes love is letting them trip. It's painful to watch. It goes against every biological instinct a parent has. You want to cushion the blow, but if you cushion every blow, the child never develops calluses. They never develop the spiritual skin thickness required to exist in an abrasive world. Bob and Martha had been loving Sarah to death, quite literally. By funding the fantasy, they were robbing her of the opportunity to develop resilience. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The silence of the car was a stark contrast to the studio. I sat there for a moment, just breathing. These stories, they take a piece of you. You can't engage with that level of raw emotion and not feel it. I felt the weight of Sarah's fear, the desperation of her parents, but I also felt the lightness of their relief. That's the payoff. That's why I do this. A few months later, I received a letter. It wasn't on parchment. It wasn't sealed with wax. It was a standard envelope with a forever stamp. It was from Sarah. She wrote about her life in the common world. She told me about a customer at the bookstore who had been rude to her, treating her like she was invisible. Old Sarah or Seraphina would have been incensed, she wrote. She would have imperiously corrected him or retreated into a fantasy where she had him beheaded. But the new Sarah just took a deep breath, realized he was probably having a bad day, and let it go. I went to the break room, had a cup of terrible instant coffee, and felt incredibly proud of myself for being so tragically normal. She also mentioned that she had started volunteering at an animal shelter, not with horses this time, but with dogs. They don't care about lineage either, she joked. They just care if you have a treat and a kind hand. It's grounding. She closed the letter with something that stuck with me. I used to think that being a princess meant you were chosen, she wrote, that you were special by birthright. Now I realize that being special is a choice you make every day. It's in how you treat people. It's in how you handle the hard stuff. I'm not a princess anymore, Dr. Phil. I'm just Sarah. And for the first time in my life, that's plenty. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer, right next to the few keepsakes I hold on to. It was a reminder that the human spirit is resilient. It can bend, it can break, it can twist itself into unrecognizable shapes to survive trauma, but with the right light, the right truth, and the right support, it can snap back. It can heal. We spend so much time in this world trying to be someone else. We want to be richer, thinner, famous, royal. We chase these avatars of ourselves, thinking that if we catch them, we'll finally be happy. But the finish line isn't becoming someone else. The finish line is coming home to who you actually are. Sarah came home. And that, folks, is the only kingdom worth ruling.